Welcome to today's webinar on equitable forms. My name's Jesse. I'm the design director here at Exygy. So excited to have Rachael join us today. Rachael Dietkus is founder of Social Workers Who Design. Really influential author who writes around trauma-informed design, has really been uh, influential for our team as we've kind of like begun to design our process and our approach to how we kind of do things internally here at Exygy. Again, if you're just joining, feel free to use the chat to put your name, where you're kind of coming in from, so we can say hi. Will be a pretty open QA. We don't have slides. We're just going to sort of talk. So if you have questions that come up, go ahead and put them in the chat. We're going to hold time at the end to do like more of a formal Q&A, but if something comes in and it's related to something we're talking about, we'll try to just roll it into the conversation. So today our topic, equitable forms. We've done a couple of these talks so far, in case you missed them the last couple of months. The first month we talked to Sean and company from Lighthouse for the Blind, where we talked about how forms can be designed to just generally be more accessible to people with disabilities. We got kind of into the technical weeds on some of that stuff. Last month, we talked to Mike Gifford from Civic Actions, where we got a little bit more into why we ask the questions we ask, how we can phrase the questions we ask. We may think we want some answers because historically we've always asked these questions, but ultimately we might not have the systems in place behind the scenes to manage that information formally or do anything with that. So it was a really good conversation last week. Today, we're going to focus specifically on more around the language that we use and how we are asking people for certain types of information, the role of the designer when working with people with lived experience who've experienced trauma. And that is why I kind of reached out serendipitously to Rachael, who's joining us today, who's an expert in this area, who's written a lot about trauma-informed design and spoken about it on how we can kind of meet the needs of vulnerable people in this space. So for context, in the public sector, the questions we choose to ask carry a lot of responsibility as well as potential vulnerabilities. So one of the biggest projects we work on at Exygy is the Bloom Affordable Housing Portal. It's an open source effort to help local governments centralize all their affordable housing in one place, making it easier for applicants to find and apply for opportunities. One essential part of Bloom is the application form. The form simplifies and standardizes the questions needed to pre-qualify residents for listings. On Bloom, we recognize that the stakes are higher for people filling out forms, so we've identified some underlying principles of what makes an equitable form. We want to ask about personal questions sensitively if there's sensitive information. We want to conduct research with people with lived experience. We want to clearly explain how that information is going to be used as it relates to sensitive information. Number two, we want to help people complete complex tasks. So we want our error message, and accidents happen, right? So we want to write non-punitive error messages that are kind of forgiving. We want to allow people to save and finish later if they're stressed about a specific situation that they're in. And then finally, we want to provide support after submission, which means we want to provide clear next steps and contact information, and we want to allow people to we want to just be open to receive feedback on the experience they just had. Like, did that work for you? Did that not work for you? So that's kind of the structure that we started with that we'll use kind of going into this conversation today with Rachael. And so I'll sit up for a minute and I'll turn it over to Rachael, who introduce herself and the work that you've done.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you for that, Jesse. And thanks for just the invitation and then just the setup of some of the conversation today. I sometimes when folks say like, share a little bit about yourself or introduce yourself, it's really easy to share a couple of things and then get caught up in your own like life story and then 45 minutes go by. So I very intentionally made some notes for things so that I can keep myself on track. But a couple of things that I want to mention that I just feel are relevant to what we're talking about today, and just definitely the work that so many of us do. I recognize a number of names here today, which is always awesome. Um, my entire like working life has been in either some form of social service or public service. So going back to being an AmeriCorps member in the late 90s to working at Veterans Affairs, I was there from as a social worker from 2010 to 2016, and then at U.S. Digital Service from 22 to 2024, and working in higher ed, working in the nonprofit sector. I'm still currently in the federal government, not for too much longer though, but I am still currently in the federal government. But today, like every other disclaimer that federal employees have to make, like, I'm definitely speaking my personal capacity. Um, but in addition to just this life of working across nonprofits, federal government, and then higher ed, I started my own like small consultancy a handful of years ago called Social Workers Who Design, and it was really just an offshoot of just getting these growing number of requests as both a social worker but also a design researcher, but being a social worker in a lot of these design spaces. And then there was this definite interest and curiosity I had around trauma informed care as it also intersected within design and social work. But that became very prevalent because of the pandemic. And so I think it's trauma and trauma informed care were things that were on a lot of people's radar before the pandemic. But I think that just that worldwide event really like elevated it to a whole other level. And so this awareness and this curiosity around trauma informed design has really been evolving from something that is like a small number of people to a growing number of people that are very curious about this, that are wanting to very intentionally practice in this way, and really just make sure that they are practicing these different elements of safety. So safety for themselves, but also safety for teams and for participants. Um, let's see, I think I already shared this in the chat that I'm in Urbana, Illinois, which is 2 hours south of Chicago. And yeah, born and raised in Illinois. So I've always been in the Midwest. I cannot see myself at this point really living anywhere else. So I'm happy to just also transition us into like one of the first questions, which is probably a good like foundation for a lot of the other things that we'll talk about. And so someone asked this question, and there's a number of these that we're going to be going through, but someone asked a question that trauma is very broad and multifaceted and a sensitive topic. So how do you define trauma as it relates to design? So this is a question that I've gotten a number of times, and or I've gotten it so many times that anytime I would do an actual like slide presentation or a workshop, like I start with that. I start with the definition. And there are a number of different definitions of trauma. There are some that are very, very clinical, some that are very medical, others that are a bit more I think just like person-centered and also take into consideration not just yet human lives, but just like all living things like on the planet. So there's this three-parter that I actually have really kind of gravitated towards, and it comes from a number of different practitioners and experts when it comes to trauma and traumatic studies. But I historically have attributed this like three-parter to Corrine Bell, Resma Menicum, and then Dr. Bruce Perry, because they're the ones that have said chunks of this like probably more explicitly. So the first part really comes from Resma, and Resma, or actually comes from Corrine Bell, where she says that trauma is anything that happens too much, too fast, and or for too long and for too soon. And so if you think of something that is like an overwhelming event, And it has like this sort of like coupling of like it's unexpected, it might happen for a long or short or even like an ongoing period of time. um and there just might be like a volume to it, so there's too much, there's like this sense of overwhelm. So that first part is Corinne Bell. The second part comes from Resma Menakem, and Resma has said this in, if you haven't heard or listened to anything that he has done, he's especially during the height of the pandemic, he was speaking on podcasts like kind of nonstop. He was doing sessions kind of like this, like pretty regularly and with a lot of different like audiences. And he's also done just some really remarkable interviews. One of the best ones that I really appreciate from him is an interview that he did with Krista Tippett, the on the On Being podcast. And so he has this phrasing that he's used both in his writing and in his like public speaking, where um, he says it's coupled with so this trauma being like something that happens too much too fast, too soon or for too long, but then it's coupled with this like this 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 element of having a lack of protection or support. So it could be that there is no one there to be with you or to just even acknowledge like the event or the thing that you went through. He also talks about how it can feel like an overwhelming like sensation, and that sensation can be like pain, or it can be like a lack of sensation, like numbness. And so like I feel like so many of the definitions of trauma often start with like maybe just like one part of these. And then the third part, which I really started to integrate, that comes from Dr. Bruce Perry. And a lot of people might know of Dr. Perry because of the work that he's done with Oprah Winfrey, and they co-wrote a book together, which is really just it's really just this long interview and conversation that they had called "What Happened to You." Um, and his he is a worldwide known like expert in childhood trauma. And so one of the things that Dr. Perry mentions is that trauma doesn't affect everyone in the same way. So, like something that may be a traumatic experience for me may not be a traumatic experience for someone else, and vice versa. And then he also talks about how like the context of an event happening is also like really essential. So this combination of like those three pieces, I think are just that has been like probably a definition that is evolved in my own practice and that I've used as I've talked about trauma in this context of design and as it relates to design. So a couple other things that I'll share here is that when we think about trauma in this context of design, like it's interesting to both see and feel and kind of like hear the evolution of different people at different times really feeling so validated and acknowledged for this word just being used in our practice. And then at the same time, I also noticed probably a couple of years ago, just more and more people having this like, well, like people don't want to talk about trauma. Like, can we come up with like a different word? Is there a different way to talk about this? And I always found that a bit interesting. It's like, like the word in and of itself is overwhelming. It's a description of overwhelming events. And so paying attention to just the perception that people had and just the way that they interact with that word, I've also found really fascinating in design. But something I also want to share is that trauma it shows up in how people both like perceive and how they interact with power, with control, with safety. It's not just about content that we might be like working towards or creating, but it's also about just so many of the different experiences that people might be asked or expected to engage in. So again, kind of like along these lines of talking about forms and experiences and various aspects of service design. That was a
Excellent.
long way of getting us to like the next question.
That's so good. Which you kind of started to answer, right? So there's myths and misconceptions. One is the word capital T trauma. You hear this, right? Capital T trauma, lowercase t trauma. Because when you say, hey, we're going to do trauma-informed design, people are like, almost like, that feels like you're saying, it feels like serious. It feels like a lot. And so you have people kind of step away and like you say, like want to ask us, well, why are we doing that? This didn't feel like something that needed that level of urgency. So like the term brings with it, like you're saying, this sense of like we did something wrong that we need to do this research. So yeah, maybe if you want to talk a little bit more about like general misconceptions, and as that leads to like then getting buy-in, right? When you're using this term now with like government partners or in the public sector, how do we like how can we what are some strategies after we get over these misconceptions where we can kind of get into like buy-in and an adoption of these practices? Yeah.
Yeah, so we could probably spend the rest of the time and probably the rest of the week just talking about like all the many myths of trauma informed design. But I try to narrow it down to like kind of like my top three. So the first one being that trauma informed care, trauma informed design means that we're offering therapy or like we're offering some type of a clinical service like to our participants as part of like research or where this is like a formal thing. So I will say that there are some organizations that are actually starting to embed social workers and various clinical people like to help expand this practice in a lot of ways. But in the sense of like trauma informed design, it's like is making this offering of therapy or some type of a clinical service like just the myth could not be like any less true. So it's not true. It's really taking a trauma informed approach is about like both reducing and really trying to mitigate harm. I personally, like other people might have different takes on this. I don't feel like we can eliminate harm. I would like to think that that's possible at some point in maybe all of our or the next generation's like lifetimes. But I really think that the focus needs to be on like how can we do our due diligence to absolutely reduce the risk of harm both to others and to ourselves, and also try to like mitigate that harm. So try to anticipate it. Something that I've probably have taken for granted as a social worker. I've been a social worker for 15 years at this point, is that I'm really comfortable with things that are uncomfortable, and it's something that I've had to really take some stock in when I've worked with designers and design teams and agencies to um, really get a sense of just that of where people stand with their own like levels of discomfort. And so I feel like some aspect within this myth is trying to find a way to not advocate for harm, but how can we be with harm? Like how can we be present while it might be surrounding us? And I feel like we've been living through so many like serious and catastrophic events over a number of years that there's no shortage of things to really be like unaffected by. So that's, myth number one is that it's about reducing harm, increasing safety, and like just making sure that we're really like we're centering dignity and like we're not providing treatment unless you are in a clinical licensed like profession where that is something that you do. So there really is this a very firm line. I think myth number two is that a lot of people, I used to hear this quite a bit several years ago. I don't hear it as much now, but I used to hear it's like, well, only some people are affected by trauma, or like surely that hasn't, that doesn't apply to us or to like what we might be doing. The reality and like one of the statistics that is often cited, I cited it myself, is at this point, literally an 11-year-old statistic that makes reference to 70% of the adult world population have experienced at least one traumatic event in their life. So again, that's from 2014, and we can think about. We don't even necessarily need to think about. We just know that significant things have happened personally, globally, politically since 2014. I would wager a bet that that percentage is 100%. It's just like trauma literally is everywhere, and for some people, it's much more prevalent. So I think that if we have this, if we believe the myth that that trauma is like an other situation or an other like problem or set of circumstances, then we aren't recognizing that we all carry experiences that might impact how we interact with one another and interact with systems. And trauma informed design is something that I believe, and I think others believe, is like it is for everyone. So not just for like what we would call like vulnerable or at risk populations. The third myth is like, which is like one that there's a theme of this that has come up quite a bit, is that designers should try to avoid trauma because it's like it's just too complex of an issue. And when I think about some of the trainings and conversations, more in-depth things that I've done, especially with a lot of like either civic technologists, people who work in public interest design, either in or adjacent to the federal government, I really think about how these aspects and these themes of avoidance actually lead to just additional harm. And designers don't have to be therapists. There are some designers who are therapists, and there are some therapists who are also designers. There's some social workers who are designers. Um, but I do think that it's really important to take some type of like ethical responsibility for like any of the things that we're building. So whether that's a form or a program, a policy, what have you. I think one of the other like biggest misconceptions that I hear is that like, well, it's both a misconception like and a request that I've gotten many times, and it's that like, well, can you just give me a checklist? Can you just give me like a very simple list so I can make sure that I am like not doing anything wrong, that I'm doing all the right things. My friend Martha, who works within the VA, she often calls it like the checklistification of things. And so we've kind of like laughed about how frustrating that can be to just like reduce something down to being a checklist. Trauma informed design is something that is continuously evolving as a practice. There isn't a set clear or a clear set of principles that are like recognized worldwide or even agreed upon, which I do think is both I think it's both a gift and a curse that we have that. I really approach this as a way of practicing and almost like a way of being. I was having a conversation with someone earlier this week, and someone had asked something along the lines of like trauma informed practice, and like where do some of those like when do you know that your practice is maybe like deepened to a certain level. And I think it's, for me, it's the way that I work. I mean, so anything that I'm doing, I'm really hoping that it is going through some type of a trauma informed lens. So either in like the work that I do day to day, who I am as like a friend, who I am as a spouse, and as a parent. So it's become like a heightened awareness for me. But it's not a list of rules, and it's a practice that can be deeply embedded and just continue to deepen like as it evolves. Um, in terms of like recommendations, so like there's a this question around like recommendations of how to get like buy-in, especially from government partners, but I also feel like it's relevant to like to really anyone. I've a lot of my interactions have often started with a single or an individual or maybe like a small team, like more often than not, of designers who know that something is off, and but they can't quite put their finger on it, and they have a hard time maybe like articulating what might be going on. So it often starts with people who are like on the ground, they're in the messy middle, they're doing the work. And then they are trying to advocate from the inside by bringing someone in from the outside to get people in leadership or people in like other positions of power or influence to um to to recognize that this is a thing that people like want and need. And so I think one of the things, there are a number of different ways that I could answer this question, but I do think that one of the things that as a very strong starting place is to frame this as a trust building practice. So it's not just like a trend in design. Like I've been talking about trauma informed design in some way, shape, or form at this point for a solid 7, 8 years. I mean, it's become just such a central part of like of I don't want to say of who I am, but like really of like of how I practice and how I talk about this work. I think also it's that there are ways to connect trauma informed design to other ways that are in existence in practice. So even yesterday, a conversation came up around um, trauma informed design having like and its interplay and interconnectedness with like diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility practices. And the specific kind of like focus was on like accessibility. It's like, well, where do accessibility practices and trauma informed design, like, where do those maybe overlap? And my immediate answer is like they don't necessarily overlap. They're interconnected. Like there's synergy between them. Like great trauma informed design is also like designed to be accessible and accessible beyond compliance. Um, I think also sometimes like one of the ways to also get potentially get like buy-in from like government and like and other partners is just to, is there just like one like small thing that could be changed within a project or a task that maybe you're working on. So even if it's like, just starting with something small is can often lead to like that scaffolding and that snowballing of like of other net positive things. So something that I would potentially take a look at would be like if we have some, in the especially at the VA, there are intake forms for flipping everything. So if you just look at like your average like intake form or digital or paper form, it's like if you just looked at it with like fresh eyes and outside of like the routine of like the day to day, it's like if you could change things to this form, like what would you change? This was a question that someone asked me when I was at USDS and working with a team at FEMA. And someone said, like, Rachel, could you just look at this like this current form that we have and just share with us like what would you change if you could just like change whatever like right now and so it looked different and had other things like what would you change? And I started with immediate simple things was like, well, like there are like 10 different font sizes on this form. Like, and so just like when you think about like hierarchy of information and like what is considered important, the thing that had like the biggest, boldest like font was like, was something to the effect of don't use this form if you haven't experienced a disaster. I was like, well, why would I have this form if I hadn't experienced a disaster? So just even just trying to get like your own like gut reaction to things, like a little bit removed from like the day to day, I think is a way to just kind of encourage other people to get them to think about maybe some of the work that you might be doing. Um, One other thing that I'll share is just I think it's important just to that when if we're going to ask people to trust us with some of their most sensitive information, um, what are we doing to earn that trust, and what are we doing to safeguard that trust? And so sometimes this is just again, this doesn't have to be like an adversarial type of question, but it really can be, depending on the context and the work situation, it can be worth asking. Just like how do we know that we are trustworthy? Like what have we maybe done to demonstrate that? And how can we articulate that to others?
Excellent. Thanks so much. I learn so much every time we talk, so I'm taking a bunch of notes. Um, you mentioned the overlap with accessibility, and I did. We talked about this earlier. I think it has to do with the misconceptions. It just maybe reminded me, like, I think with accessibility, some people think, oh, you're born with a disability, and you're disabled, And that is what disabled people are. Where it's like at Microsoft has that really good spectrum we talked about is like there's fixed disability, and then there's just a spectrum, and there's a lot of disabilities that are temporary, and there's a lot of disabilities that are situational. So
Mhm.
you can be in a situation where you are disabled, you don't have access to an ability. So like and so we're like everybody at some point, like you're saying, at some point will experience a trauma, a temporary trauma, or a situation which is traumatizing, and like designing around that full spectrum rather than getting out of this rigid idea that there's this one type is also super helpful. Is everything you're saying just it reminded me of that. Um, and so, which again, everything you're saying around so forms themselves, how we design for forms, you started to talk a little bit about text hierarchy and how we can kind of like get into the technical aspects of design. So to kind of bring us again topically where we are, forms themselves are there to help us get something, right? I need to get this benefit, right? But I have to accomplish something to do it. You need information from me. Sometimes that information is very challenging or sensitive, right? So life events such as divorce, bereavement, job loss, immigration status, unstable housing, while they might also, these things qualify you for benefits, right? But there's a lot of stigma, shame, stress that come along with even having to communicate and recognize that that is me, right? So how, and then that could cause a person to drop out. I can't do this right now. This is bringing up a lot for me. I have this need, but I can't bring myself to fill out the very form which will allow myself to claim it. So, what can we do for those people in those situations to kind of help with those moments, right? So, yeah, anything you have in that regard would be super helpful, I think.
Yeah, I love that we talked through this question a bit last week, Jesse. So I mean, I think it's so easy to see just a form as just we're just collecting data, it's not that big of a deal. But so many of these forms, especially in government services, it's not just a form, and there's varying degrees of intimate details that are often requested. And so it's whether it's a digital form or a paper one, because some forms are still like on paper, and some transactions are still happening on paper. It's the thing is that these are like snapshots of someone that is probably either in a very like vulnerable situation, or they're truly in a state of crisis. So I really, when I think about so many of the different types of like projects that I've worked on, especially over the past 4 or 5 years, at one point, I started to come up with just like a real simple like rubric, and some of this like started initially just for myself because I think this is true for a lot of designers, but I'll only speak for myself. I'm like this is the polite way of saying that I'm a very nosy person, is that I'm deeply curious, and so I really had to like gut check myself and really come to a sense of like, are these questions that I really need to ask? Are these questions like what am I even going to do with the responses if I get a response to this question? Like, and really like thinking through like how might someone really perceive this question while they're in probably either in the midst, or they're being reminded of a very difficult hard moment in their life. Um, I think it's like, would I be okay like answering this question? Like would I want to answer this question? Would I be comfortable answering this if it was during like a time of like grief, or a time of any kind of like instability in my own life? And I can tell you, and I think we all know this, it's like, especially when it comes to like grief or really kind of any instability, it's rarely timed or scheduled. It shows up at the most unexpected moments. And so even when we have something that's maybe like scheduled and coordinated, and someone is maybe has had that time to like process and get ready, like when that time comes, that still might not be an ideal time, or that might still be like an overwhelming time. I really think that, especially when it comes to government services, I think it is just essential that we just consider the emotional weight of what we are asking. So not just like the technical wording, although that is also important, but also like what is the potential like heaviness that can come as a result of this. Like I've seen so many, God, there are just so many examples of this. I feel like we at some point maybe there can be like we just have like a show and tell of people bringing different examples of questions that feel very big and very heavy, and are really really sensitive, and also are coupled with like ambiguity. So it's like it's one thing to be asked an extremely sensitive question, but then it's another thing to not know, like, well, how much is expected of me to share as the participant or as the respondent? Is it okay to say, like, can I say one word, or do I have to give like my entire life story? And so if we don't like provide that transparency up front and give that information and that clarity up front, I think that just contributes to that ambiguity. It can contribute to that nervousness, possibly fueling some of that shame, that self shame of like, oh, I like this. There's this thing, and I've got to talk about it, but I don't know how much they want. You've just put people in some type of a guessing game. So I would test these questions. So one simple way is just to like test them amongst your team. Even if the question isn't applicable to someone like within your team, just get like a try to get like a gut check or a gut feeling of like, how does this land, or how do you think this might land? Like do that as like as an absolute bare minimum. And then I think if you're able to like bring in individuals who have that lived and that living experience to offer their guidance and steer you in a direction that is going to be more receptive to the person who is on the receiving end of that question and needing to answer it.
Um, Excellent. So moving on and keeping us on the forms thing, it helps to kind of take all these like big ideas and focus it on this to make it like
Yeah.
applicable. So I'm filling out a form, uh, and I make a mistake, right? We do that, right? Either through one of a number of things. The form maybe doesn't recognize my input, or I'm not exactly sure what it's asking for, but there there are going to be errors. And when you make mistakes, you kind of feel like a little twinge of like, depending on where you're coming from, you feel different levels of shame or disorientation. So, are there examples you can give about how either content creators, designers, and engineers can kind of get intentional around error messages? I say this because like error messages, we work with engineers a lot, like are kind of uh, buried in the technology, right? The tool itself creates a default error message, and usually it's highly technical or highly scripted. And and if you want to customize that, you have to be very intentional about what you want to say, and it has to relate to the content. That's a lot of work. And so, but there's so many questions you could ask. And so, what kind you have to have a framework for how you approach specific types of questions so that design can provide good UX copy to engineers so they can systemize that kind of and have that kind of part of the experience. So yeah, how do we do that, or what are some solutions there?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you use the word like just disorienting or disorientation. And I think when there's a disorienting like error message that might come up, it's beyond maybe something that's just like annoying. It can feel like you're being punished. And again, like sometimes these exchanges of the emotions and the feelings in the moment, they might be very fleeting. It might only be happening for like a handful of seconds, but it can contribute to something that might already be like a very stressful situation and just adding more stress to it. So one way to really think about this is that, so instead of some aspect of punishing or blame, it's like how can you shift from an a anything like sounding like blame to something that's more like compassionate. So instead of so in the context of forms, if we think about any of our like shopping experiences, like so if you're doing like personal like online shopping, you know, I'm sure like people have had the experience of like, you maybe you put something in a cart and then like, and then you leave the cart, or you're like you decide you don't want it anymore, and various messages like start popping up. It's like, are you sure? So like these questions of doubt, that are trying to just entice you back in. But when it comes to a form, something common language that is there is something like this field is required, or it might have like the red asterisk, and so we know that, or there might be some like signal or symbol that is letting us know like this is a thing that we can't skip. But instead of saying this field is required, like what if there was something that said like why you needed that information? So like one phrase could be like, we need this information to in order to like move your application forward, or this information will be helpful for, you know, fill in the blank people who are like reviewing this thing. Um, this phrasing, this like very like simple kind of like positive reinforcement phrasing came up like a ton on a VA project that I worked on when I was at USDS. And it was related to, one of the disability claims processes as it relates to PTSD and military sexual trauma. And we just knew that we needed to build in these like these reassurances, and just so include some of these phrases of like the reason why we're asking for certain information, or some kind of like context that lets someone know that something might be necessary. But it can be very easy, and like you touched on this, Jesse, it can be very easy for people to like, to self-blame, or to maybe even like self-criticize, like while you're going through these processes, and especially when things go wrong. So it's I think it's unfortunate human nature, and sometimes it is a true traumatic response that people just they self-criticize, and they assume that they are the one that is in the wrong, or that they did something wrong. And so within the design can we do to like redirect that blame more toward like the system or the design, and not the individual who is like filling out the form. And again, just kind of put things through that filter. It's like, are we, is what we're saying, or what we're putting in addition to these forms, are we putting in language that is offering like compassion? Are we putting in language that is that's offering reassurance, or are we just being like directive, and are we just demanding? Again, like there's ways to like say the same thing that can have a very, very different delivery and reception from people.
Excellent. So if folks have additional questions that they want to add, please go ahead and put them in the chat. I have a couple more here, but happy to take new ones as they kind of occur to folks. So we'll get meta with this one around like the role of the designer. This one's probably a little might be a little spicy. That's like, so we've talked about the things we build, the forms. Well, there's this process of like getting the information, validating the information that we even have to even approach the design. So what is the role of the researcher in the social sector, working with people who are in need? Um, how can teams align on a shared sense of roles and responsibilities, and how can we bring in specialists when we're outside of our area of expertise? And I think this relates a little bit to an article you wrote. I think there might have been a talk as well that some of the design team here attended, which is like, is it the role of the designer to kind of lean in to with shared experience when it comes to specific types of trauma or specific types of life events, right? What is the role of the designer? One camp would have the designer should remain neutral. My job is to collect information. My job is to create a safe container where you can feel safe and give me the information. And another sort of camp says, my job is to kind of lean in and make this person not feel isolated and alone, and be a human with them and kind of meet them where they are. Um, Where do you stand on that? And though it's highly debatable and very context specific, it can very much be done well, it can very much be done wrong. It might relate to like what you said before, there's no checklist here. This is not like a checklist process. It might need to be something that's highly situational. So yeah, how does somebody evaluate the appropriate level of bringing self or remaining neutral to those research spaces?
Yeah. Oh my God. This is such a these are all
A
important
light one, just
questions.
a light
I know,
question.
just a little lighthearted one in the last 10 minutes. Well, I really want to like shake my fist at IDEO for saying like, walk in someone else's shoes. It's like I feel like they ruined like how we should really be like compassionate and authentic while doing any of this kind of work, whether you're a designer or a social worker or just a human. Unless you are wearing like a dual or multiple hats across different disciplines, like if you just put on like your design hat, like designers are trained and practiced to be like meaning makers, and so unless you are formally trained or have significant continuing education or professional development as a mental health provider, you should just never ever pretend to be one. And I've seen some people like really dip their toe into that space and feel comfortable almost uh being like I'll just say like overly like therapeutic, which has it's a slippery slope. It's a very very fine line. Because if you bring people in too much but then you don't know how to handle it, if it gets to be overwhelming for you, then you have so clearly overstepped your boundary. You are definitely acting out of your scope of practice. So like, yeah, I've written about and talked about like scopes of practice, like what does it mean to be like to have a scope of practice? Like this is something that is common for clinical professions and especially for social workers. But all that said, just because a designer may not be like a trained mental health professional, it doesn't absolve them from being like caring. And so if you're working with people who have experienced trauma, and if you know that you're working on a topic that where there is just an explicit awareness that trauma is so deeply like ingrained in that subject matter, I think that there's an ethical responsibility to bring in like trauma informed specialists, to bring in peer researchers, to bring in those individuals that have that lived and living experience, have that professional like grounding and training in order to really help a team like navigate those scenarios. That's a large part of the kind of work that I do is like a team will bring me in like for like the kind of like the life cycle of a project to essentially be their guide along the way. And that can look like a lot of different things, from like helping to co-craft like the research plans, to go over the questions, to be part of the actual research sessions, to like help support the researchers like after the sessions if sessions are pretty overwhelming, because sometimes they are. To also just thinking about like timing and like how many people should we interview in a given day or in a given week, and how do we have our meeting structured? Are we giving ourselves space to just kind of like catch our breath after sometimes these very heavy sessions? um the thing on self-disclosure, so self-disclosure is it's a hot topic in social work, and there are many different schools of thought. I think a responsible and both kind of like neutral point, and one where I have like again early on in my like social work career, and just from coming out of like an MSW program, like the training, the educational training was very much like it is not about you. It is never about you as a social worker. It is always about the person. So like this other person and that person in their environment. And so I want to, I've had some like evolved thoughts on this because I've just been in practice for a long time and definitely practice at this intersection of social work and design. So I want to like the advice that I want to give is to only share something if it serves that participant. So don't do that. Don't share something to build rapport with someone or to ease your own discomfort. I think it's very, very easy to like either share or overshare when we get nervous and to like kind of like say too much. But I think really just making sure that you're prepared for like to the best of your ability before, during, and after research, and have a sense of like what might you say if something were to come up. That's probably it's probably like a good like nugget of advice to end that question on.
Okay. We have some questions in the chat, so I want to open it up and make sure we're bringing some of this stuff in. One centers around design justice. So I'll just kind of you probably can read it yourself, but I'll read it for folks. One principle of design justice says we center the voices of those who are directly impacted by the outcomes of the design process. So design justice is something at Exygy that includes a lot of ideas from trauma-informed design and disability justice and applies towards design and engineering and technology services. Anything, curious, Rachel, if you've interacted with these principles before and have any thoughts around.
Yeah, I mean, I love the Design Justice Network. So if you aren't familiar with the Design Justice Network, like definitely like visit that link. I you know like follow the work of the group. I've been a dues paying member for I don't know how long. It's been a number of years at this point. Um, I've read parts of the book. I haven't read like all of Sasha's book from like cover to cover, but Sasha Kasinzachuk like wrote the book like Design Justice, which is kind of like an extension of like of this actual like very broad network and group of people and set of principles. Yeah, they're very much aligned with like disability justice. I would say like also like equity centered design, a lot of like anti-racist principles in design definitely are like have like a very similar like look and feel as like as the design justice network principles as well. Yeah, it's good stuff. Really, really good stuff. And I think one of the greatest benefits that I've seen with that network is just all of the different nodes. So if you like have like chapters around the country or around the world, like they call them nodes. So there are nodes that are literally all over the world. And I enjoy hearing how other people are practicing, how they might be like actually integrating those principles into like their own practice or their own like work organization, but also how are these principles being taught in higher ed and or in like workshops too. So yeah, I'm gonna give a big heart and a plus to that one.
Cool. One more. By the way, I'm putting contact information for Rachel and Exygy in the chat for those who are joining us from outside of Exygy. Please do feel free to reach out to Rachel for follow-ups and read more of her amazing work. I have a question. Hanan, do you want to just go ahead and ask your own question? I don't have to ask it for you. So sorry.
Yeah, so my question is, how do we as designers, we create space for ourselves, meaning like what conditions should we, like expectations should we set up so that we have more control or can influence decisions that, would impact how trauma informed something is. So my examples are like, finance needs this information, there's nothing you can do about it. Paper regulation or reduction act, which influences a lot of how a lot of government agencies are allowed to collect information. What do we do with these constraints? Yeah, just practical advice there.
Yeah. Yeah, PRA must be like, did we all get a memo? I swear it is on everyone's mind this week. You're the fourth person today, Hanan, to mention PRA. So hopefully you're the last person to mention it today. It's like everybody keeps like it's on everybody's mind. I say that kind of like jokingly. I think I'm gonna go with my gut instinct with this response and share a person and a resource that I feel like has been helpful for me. So I'm not gonna like I'm having a harder time like explicitly giving like good tangible like on the spot advice, but I'm thinking about this person who is an architect named Liz Ogbu. So Lizogbu. And Liz, in a lot of her work, she talks about how do we create the conditions for care, and how do we create the conditions for care when we're doing kind of like anything, but like doing things, especially in the built environment. and like and her writing on this, I think she even has like a piece. If you just looked up Liz Ogbu and conditions of care, there's a piece of writing that she's done that's in a few different spots, that kind of talks about this thing. You know, the biggest thing, especially if you're navigating, you know, regulations and various things that might just give us these like these forced limitations, is to try to like buy some time. I feel like time is like the precious resource that we are constantly trying to like just speed through. And so like what can we do to like slow down some things, to like add add the friction of non-urgency into our processes. And I think that that opening, I think that creates an opening for like care to really like flourish even more. But you know, I've been talking a bit more like lately, just like resisting like urgency culture and like really paying attention to like when does that come up, because it's sometimes it's not super explicit or very overt. It's really really nuanced. So a nuanced example is like back to back meetings, you know, like that. I feel like that is a byproduct of like of modern day digital urgency culture. So what can we do to just like create more spaciousness for us to make sure that we're both caring for ourselves but have that time to actually care for others that we are working with and hopefully like designing with, and not just always like designing at or designing for.
Feel like we could just keep going. Thank you
I
so much.
know.
We're at time. This is such rich stuff. So much. Thank you so much for Rachel for coming and talking to us. Hopefully we can talk again really soon. We're gonna send out this recording. If you missed part of it, you'll get an email follow up shortly. We'll also try to send the links to the other two talks we did before with Mike Gifford and Lighthouse, so you can kind of watch all that stuff together. We are kind of try to talk Rachel into coming back and doing a full house where we actually have Mike and Lighthouse and Rachel all together at the table at the same time, maybe with another special guest to kind of talk about all these ideas at once, but we'll see. But yeah, please watch your emails for the recording. Again, thank you so much, Rachel, for making the time for us today.
Yeah,
Amazing.
thank
Thank
you.
you. Excellent. Cool. Well, yeah, thanks everybody who was able to come and yeah, let everybody get back to their days. Thank you so much.